So my presentation will be divided into around about three or four sections. First, I will share with you the global experiences, what we do around the world. And then I talk something about very specific to the East Asia region, the opportunity, what are the opportunities in the region, and then something about the political economy of its implementations, and last slide on the lessons learned from our global experiences. So the World Bank has been quite heavily involved in this implementation around the world. We have done 133 projects in the last 28 years, investment, $5 billion investment. And we have been involved in more than 79, around 80 countries. And whenever we are involved, we not only present, we bring the technology expertise, but also the expertise of public financial management and procurement, because this is all integrated with each other, as moderator just explained. So before any country starts implementing IFMIS, I think the fundamental question is that why we are implementing IFMIS. So you can start implementing IFMIS because you want to operational efficiencies. This is every digitalization or every automation project, of course, brings some elements of operational efficiency. But the biggest benefits are the top two, the fiscal discipline. And Dimitri and Marcellins might have spoken about the controls and the treasury and the financial management. And IFMIS is the technology that implements those controls. So fiscal discipline, and one of the biggest thing is the budget compliance. You want to make sure that everybody complies with the budget, and you want to make. So this is helpful in your cash management. So the last, which is the transparency of financial reporting. Through IFMIS, you can produce reports which are not only helpful in transparency, but also further decision-making. So the rationale is very important. Many countries say that we just want to implement IFMIS because of the transparency in financial reporting, which is fine, but there are other benefits that come along. So whenever you implement IFMIS, the technology issues sometimes dominate the discussion, but I wanted us to focus more on the policy issues. What are the policy perspectives that we must consider when we are implementing IFMIS? So institutional coverage and coordination for IFMIS is important. In many countries, there's one centralized IFMIS, which is used by the whole of the government. And in extreme examples like France and Pakistan, IFMIS is used not only by the central government, but also by the subnational government.
Okay.
So what I was saying was that the policy issues should be considered before implementing IFMIS, because in many settings I have seen that technology dominates the discussion. People talk about, oh, we want to implement Oracle, we want to implement SAP, but while ignoring the policy issues. So some of the policy issues I have highlighted here are, for example, the institutional coverage and coordination. In many settings, so for example, in many countries, there is a centralized IFMIS, which means that whole government is using one IFMIS system, like Malaysia, for example, or Korea and some other country. And in extreme examples like Pakistan and France, IFMIS system is used by the central government as well as by the subnational governments. But in some settings, like Portugal, there is a decentralized IFMIS. Of Saudi Arabia, every ministry has its own IFMIS. At least the large ministries have their own IFMIS, which is a decentralized IFMIS deployment model. So the institutional coverage should be considered. Similarly, the second biggest point is the Treasury single account. So this is again very important. You have to not only implement the technology, but also consider how we can strengthen the Treasury single account through the use of technology for better cash management. Third point is the budget accounts. It should be unified, it should be harmonized, not only within all the government at the central level, but also with the subnational levels. Without that, you cannot have a consolidated financial statements. Commitment control is another policy issue which needs to be considered. In many settings, they have implemented IFMIS, but commitment control is very weak, as you will see in my later slides. Payment processing. So whether you want to do the payment processing through a centralized model, where every ministry or spending units bring their vouchers to a central treasury office, or a decentralized payment model like Philippines, in which every spending unit has its own payment processing the powers. So that is another issue that you need to consider, because it helps to decide the deployment models. Financial reporting, again, many countries start with cash, but over time they build it on the cash management standards and move it to the accrual. So this is another aspect that need to be considered in terms of policy. In terms of sequencing of reforms, the big question is readiness versus impact. So in many settings, 20% of the ministries spend 80% of the budget. So if you focus on just those 20%, 5 or 6 ministries, like Ministry of Health, Education, maybe Defense, or Police, or maybe some public work infrastructure ministry, they spend 80% of the budget. So they will have much more impact, while you just focus on the 20% of the ministries. Similarly, another aspect of the sequencing is the basics first. In many countries, people have tried to implement everything, perfect system. That has failed actually. So just focus on the basics first and then build on that. That's another policy issue that you need to decide upfront. One last point is the technical staffing. Often people ignore that system needs to be maintained. They don't have technical staff. So this is almost every is struggling with that. You need to consider that while you are deploying IFMIS. So this is the big picture of the coverage. This you might have seen it in IMF. This is derived from IMF CFS, basically classification. So typically, SOEs have their own system. You don't need to worry about SOE. They are independent entities. Even they are part of the public sector, but the IFMIS deployment is typically within the general government. And within the general government, as you can see in this slide, central government is one aspect, and you have the regional governments and maybe cantonments and municipalities. And then within the central government, the budgetary entities, which is fine, which are the MDAs, but then contingency funds or other grants in the region and states, and there are other self-accounting entities, which in many settings are not within IFMIS, and you have consolidation problems. So you have to consider these the coverage gaps, which are very, very important for the consolidation of financial statements. Again, if you can see, this is a big picture of the IFMIS architecture in the government. So at the bottom, you might see on the left side that these are the IFMIS modules, like commitment control, accounts payable, accounts receivables. But in the middle, you have a lot of non-IFMIS systems, like the payroll system and pension system and debt management system, asset management system, public investment management system, or audit management system. It's somehow related to IFMIS for reporting or some for various reasons. And then you have other systems like e-procurement system or central bank payment system or customs and tax system, which are also important. So the information from these other non-IFMIS systems is necessary for consolidation. So typically the question is asked, can I use IFMIS for consolidation? The answer is generally no. Consolidation is generally done outside of IFMIS with specialized systems or modules called consolidation modules. And these consolidation systems have inter-entity clearing functionalities and consolidation functionalities and many other things and analytics facilities. So a good architecture is that you have a separate consolidation system rather than if you use IFMIS for consolidation purposes. Again, this is the Treasury single account deployment model from around the world. Typically, there are two models. The Treasury-centric model, in which you have a centralized Treasury office where all the payments are processed. And the second is the spending unit-centric deployment model, in which there is no Treasury office, like Philippines. Every spending unit has the payment processing powers. But in our global experience, Treasury-centric model is easier to implement. Because typically, if you have, let's say, 50 treasuries or 100 treasuries, it's easier to deploy a system at 100 treasury offices rather than 30,000 or 50,000 spending. And then you have various TSA models like centralized, even within Treasury single Treasury centric model, you have a centralized TSA like Russia, Zambia, and Ghana, or a decentralized in which each ministry has its own account, even if the accounts are controlled by the Treasury. So those options are very, very important because you want, at the end of the day, you want to aggregate your cash for better cash management. Budget classification, I would not get into the details, but typically you have these are various aspects of the harmonized budget classification, functional classification or organization classification, funds classification, and program classification. And at the bottom, you have the economic classification. But one feature that I have noticed in many countries that the program classification is too complex, too complicated. So you don't need to overcomplicate the program classification. Two-level program classification is rather simpler and better because if you get into too much details of activities, then you are it's not very neat design because a lot of activities are actually economic classification codes. It makes the budget hugely voluminous, very big, and it's very difficult to prioritize. It loses the objectives of the program classification. So, I mean, there are a lot of details into that, but I will not get to just give you a flavor of, what sort of complexity you have to consider before you implement it in terms of chart of account and budget classification. Another important thing that we have noted around the world is the weak commitment control. And actually, in many countries, they have implemented IFMIS without the commitment control. So, I mean, you have to sequence some model, but commitment control is very important. I just give you one example. Let's say you have a budget of 10. And let's say you have a contract commitment of 2. Right? So the available budget would be 8 in the system. But if you are not recording commitments, then the 2, which is the commitment you are missing, and the available budget is still 10, which is the wrong information. You don't have the correct information about the available budget. And obviously then commitment control can also be used for cash management purposes. So it is important to consider commitment control as part of the IFMIS implementation carefully. And many countries want to move from cash to accrual accounting. IFMIS, the modern IFMIS architectures can help ease the transition from cash to accrual. So what they have is that they have dual ledger technology, which means you can have a cash ledger as the ledger that the users are using at the front end. And these cash transactions are automatically converted into accrual transactions at the back end, right? So, for example, if you have an expenditure transaction, on the cash ledger, it will be recorded as expenditure. But at the back end, if it is an asset, then it will be converted automatically into an asset entry, which is accrual entry, basically. So, and Malaysia and Indonesia are doing that. I was recently in Malaysia and I interacted with them, with the government counterparts, and you will see also maybe in the Malaysia presentation. In terms of sequencing, again, my message is that try to focus on the problem that you are trying to solve. In many settings, people jump to technology. If you see in this presentation, technology comes last, actually. Start with the diagnostic, what is a problem that we are trying to solve? And then consider the policy aspects that need to be addressed or fixed before you start implementing the technology. Then you do the business process review, detailed business process review to see, how can we improve our processes? And based on the improved business processes, you implement the technology. So I was saying that capacity how do you build capacity for technical staffing? So typically there are three models: build capacity, buy capacity, and borrow capacity. So building capacity, three B's basically. So building capacity means you train people, you build. Buy mean there are certain skills that you cannot build, for a 1 month training, like IT, let's say IT security expert or database or system administrator or a programmer. You cannot make a programmer in 1 month or 2 months or even 6 months. These people are experts and they have 5 years or maybe 10 years they have invested into building these skills. So you need to buy those skills which you cannot build within a short period of time. And you can buy them on the market based salaries because these people are very the skills are attractive to the markets and it's very difficult to retain them if you do not pay them the market based salaries. So you have to find a model. And there are certain skills that you need to borrow, which is the very most advanced skills. For example, the patches in the system, SAP system or Oracle system. So for that, you have to have a service level agreement with the third party firms to do extremely complex maintenance jobs. So that is a borrow basically. So I have seen if you focus on the bottom part, so there are various ways in which countries do that. You can hire the consultant on market-based salaries, or you can create a private limited company within the Ministry of Finance or Treasury outside the salary scales of the civil servants to pay them, on market-based salaries. This is many countries have adopted this model, like South Africa and France, and Pakistan is trying to do that, but so far they have not been successful. In some countries, you pay them special allowance within the regular government salaries or positions, but somehow you have to compensate them on the market-based salaries. Otherwise, you will find it very difficult to retain them. The last model is the outsourcing model. Some European countries have done outsourcing. Generally, it's a very expensive model, but again, it depends on your country context because you hire a third-party firm to do the maintenance. Obviously, they are much more expensive than hiring individual consultants. One of the biggest problems in most of the IFMIS implementations is the political economy. So, this is a budget book of a country. I don't want to name the country. And the book is, I think, 1,200 pages or 1,500 pages thick. And when I went to that country, I put a Pepsi Cola bottle to just give the sense of how thick the book is actually. It is almost the height of the Pepsi Cola. And it took us many, many years to simplify the budget. And it was only because of the political economy. I know one country in the East Asia region where I was working recently. The budget book of one city is 9 times this budget book. I mean, this thick budget book, you can spread across the whole table actually, 9 or 10 books. Because the budget classification is so complex and nobody wants to change. They are used to seeing very, very detailed activity codes in the budget. You have activity code budget for even sharpeners and pencils and highlighters. So you are using the budget classification for procurement items. If you want to track sharpeners and highlighters, you can have procurement items, but not the economic classification. So these are all political economy issues that apparently you don't see them. But when you start implementing the reforms, you see them, and they are the very, this is I would typically call it a 400-pound gorilla, which is everywhere, but which is not visible. So this is another slide. I don't want to go into the detail. Basically, you have the PFM policy, the donor, the civil service, the users, but everywhere there is political economy. You have MDAs, you have the experts, the previous experts, the legacy system, the vendors who are benefiting from the legacy system. So all these politics plays into this. But generally, my advice is that even with the political economy, you stay engaged. You involve the people who cause resistance and educate them constantly and try to make alliances of the winners, but never disengage. Basically, it's a difficult path, but you have to take this path. You cannot ignore these people. Yes, you cannot bulldoze them. So this is just the overview of the global experiences. But now I will focus on the East Asia context. What are the opportunities in East Asia? So this is a very broad brush picture of East Asian countries. Typically, you can divide them into countries who have very basic systems, evolving systems, and very mature systems. So on the left, you have countries like Myanmar and Laos and Philippines who have not been able to put in place IFMIS. At least until a few years ago, when I was involved, Myanmar, I know very clearly. I was involved in Philippines, and Laos, I know that they are putting together an IFMIS standard. So they are using spreadsheets basically to do the budget control and reporting. And then on the other extreme, you have extremely mature countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and Korea. And then you will hear some experience from maybe Korea and Malaysia later on. And then you have countries in between. So, yeah, so the countries in between are struggling with coverage. They have a decent IFMIS system, but the coverage is weak. There are still large part of the budget which is being processed outside of IFMIS. Even in Pakistan, Maldives, and Cambodia, I know I was in Cambodia a few years ago. So, and you will hear something about Cambodia as well in the next section. So, so what can we do? So for the basic countries, my message is that you put in place an IFMIS. But when you are putting in place IFMIS, then when you are putting in place IFMIS, then 80-20 rules would be better. No, it will focus on the big ministries first, which are spending 80% of the budget. Then you can get quick results. Another way of getting quick results is the consolidation of financial reporting. You don't need to roll out IFMIS across the whole country before you can start producing the reports. You can put in place some ad hoc consolidation system and start consolidating on the financial statements so that you can get some quick wins without waiting for 7 years or 8 years. And then you can do the chain management and digital skills and all that stuff. In the countries which are evolving, of course, these countries have a very decent IFMIS system, but the coverage is weak. The integration is weak. So you start expanding the coverage and start building the interfaces with the other systems, and also do improve the disclosures of financial statements, and maybe develop some dashboard or analytics, and publication of financial statements. And of course, the mature countries like Malaysia, for example, they have very decent IFMIS at the central level, but they are still struggling at the subnational level. So maybe the focus should be to go deeper now, to go to the subnational level. And then again, they have some data analytics, but the data analytics is more on the financial side. The non-financial KPIs are actually weak in some countries, even if they are mature. So they can now focus on combining the financial information with the non-financial information to track the key performance indicators of the government, and maybe develop heat maps, analytics, dashboards. So these are some of the opportunities for mature countries. So what are the lessons learned? Almost in every country, wherever there was success, we have noted that leadership played a very, very critical role. Typically, there is a reform leader within the country. And that leader could be a minister or a secretary or a director level person who can do a lot of, because there are institutional weaknesses, So personalities do matter in environments where there are institutional weaknesses. Another I have mentioned earlier that policy issues are important. They complement the technology. So the discussion should be driven by the problem that you are trying to solve, and the policy complements that no needs to go with the technology. In many countries, we have seen technology dominates the discussion, which should not be the case. You should focus on the problems that you are trying to solve. Again, same message. Diagnostic is key to understanding the problems. Adopting a problem-driven approach has a more higher chances of success. Typically, this is a question asked, best practices versus. I'm a strong proponent of best fit, not rather than the best practice. I mean, something is working in France, it may not work in Malaysia or Indonesia or Myanmar. But the principles do matter. So, what are the basic principles? You want transparency. You don't want to overspend. Just to give you two examples. So, don't want to overspend, then whatever it makes sense to stop people from oversense, adopt those policies. You don't need to do exactly how France does or Pakistan does, but just focus on, the basic principle is that you don't want to overspend. Coverage gaps are, most of the countries are struggling because of the coverage gaps. So they have implemented IFMIS, but large part of the budget is still processed outside of IFMIS. So if you enhance the coverage gap, the benefits that come with the IFMIS will be enhanced automatically. The fiscal discipline will improve, the financial reporting will improve, the transparency will improve. So just focusing on the coverage gap is very, very fundamental. Again, integration can enhance impact. So there are several systems that needs to be integrated with IFMIS, like e-procurement system for commitment control, integration with the bank for payments. You need to send you need to stop writing the checks and send electronic fund transfer transactions to the bank through integration. Similarly, integration with the revenue management system or debt management system and other systems is very, very important. It can enhance impact. As I mentioned earlier, consolidation of financial reports through a consolidation tool could be a quick win. So that's again, try to implement a consolidation system alongside FMIS and bring the transactions from the various sources into the consolidation tool to develop the reports. And again, bureaucracy works in a very different way. You have files and everything goes through some approval process. The IFMIS implementations are not implemented through bureaucracy. You need to have a project culture. So what is the project culture and how it is different from bureaucracy? In the project culture, you have a project plan once, and maybe there are 3,000 activities in a project plan. You don't need to get approval for each and every activity in a file. You just develop a plan, get the approval of the plan, and then you implement the plan. So the dynamics are very different. And then you communicate incessantly with all the stakeholders, which is different from bureaucracy. Similarly, the head of the user is the king. That is another different, something very different. Normally, our secretaries and ministers are at the top of the head. But in a project culture where you are implementing it, user is the king. And the director or whoever is implementing it, he is just there to serve the users. So these are some of the aspects of the project culture that can promote and enhance the effectiveness. And last, I think, point is the political economy. Never underestimate the political economy. There are always vested interests or lack of knowledge, or just habits, So you need to involve all these people who can cause resistance. Most of the time, the most knowledgeable people of the previous system are the ones who are causing the biggest hindrances. They just don't want to leave the old things. So what do? Do you ignore them? Never. You need to engage them. You need to communicate them. You need to involve them. It's a constant struggle, but you need to do that. And then eventually, after doing all these things, you should enforce, because you cannot endlessly engage and communicate and involve. At the end of the day, you have to enforce the policies. So this is my last slide. I will be very happy to take questions. Thank you very much for your attention.